Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have with us today Nadia Sabeh, president and founder of a company called Dr. Greenhouse. Dr. Greenhouse recently announced a partnership with Forever Feed Technologies to design a controlled environment for what's being called by the companies as the world's largest sustainable animal feed mill. So we're quite interested in learning what you're up to. Welcome, Nadia. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this project and about what we do.
For those of you that are joining us here online, we thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. So the tagline for Dr. Greenhouse is agriculture, anytime, anywhere. So what is Dr. Greenhouse and what value do you see your company offering livestock producers, and for that matter, other markets? Because I know you're active across a number of different sectors.
Sure. So, Dr. Greenhouse, we are a mechanical and agricultural engineering firm. We basically design climate control systems for greenhouses and indoor farms and indoor production systems, typically for plants. But we've also designed facilities growing mushrooms, growing insects, which I know is hot in the feed industry, as well as some other crops that might be not be used for directly for food for human consumption. But typically, the crops that we support are lettuce, tomatoes, cannabis, microgreens. I mean, you name it. Really, anything that farmers are trying to grow in a controlled environment, we want to support them. I say anytime, anywhere. That's our tagline because for me, the opportunity is having that ability to manage the resources, the inputs, and the environment that we give crops in order to grow. We know that they need light. We know that they need water and nutrients. We know that they need, a certain environment, temperature and humidity and wind conditions in order to grow and to thrive. And that's not always possible everywhere in the world, right? We also know, with climate change that it's becoming more and more challenging with limited resources such as water and even fertilizer, finding ways that we can reduce those inputs in order to produce even more food, right? We have to find a way to feed 9 billion people, not just calories, but also nutrients, vitamins, and minerals that are essential to life. That's what we do. We have designed or worked on nearly 200 projects all over the world. We've been in 32 states here in the US, 6 Canadian provinces, and every continent except for Antarctica and Australia. Though I consider none of it way up in northern Canada, basically Antarctica, which we have designed a facility up there. So, we're really excited at the prospects of what controlled environment agriculture can do to feed the world and to feed our pets and our livestock going into the future.
Very interesting. So now you recently, as I mentioned, entered into an agreement with the Forever Feed Technologies group and to design an environment for feeding a dairy out in California, I believe. Talk
Yeah.
to us a little bit about that project. What all does it involve?
Yeah, so we are growing wheatgrass to basically as a feedstock source for a dairy farm in Hanford, California. It's an existing dairy farm, and there's a lot of feed inputs, obviously. And by growing wheatgrass on site with with the land and the resources that they have, that's actually one of the opportunities that they have to control a part of their supply chain, right? And not just are they going to get it, but what is going to be the quality of that feed source, and is it going to be consistent year round? So this is one way for them to control that for themselves. But what got us really excited about the project was that from day one, from the very first conversation we had with them, they were talking about environmental impact, that they only wanted to do this project if it actually reduced the environmental impact of feed production. And so we were talking, about water, about land use, about, the carbon footprint, about methane generation. And so, from the very beginning, we we're talking about how can we grow this feed in a really sustainable way that will work for us here in Hanford, but that, other people potentially could use in the future, because we know that these resources are really limited all over the world, the Middle East and Asia, and South America and Brazil. The amount of land that we have available, the arable land to grow some of these feedstock sources is becoming more and more limited. And either, we see deforestation in some places. We also see, some of these other places, finding arable land and water in other countries and other locations, like here in the Western US, to grow their feed, and then they ship it, right? And then there's feed miles
Mhm.
associated with that to ship it back to the ranches in other parts of the world. So if we can find a way to do this locally, to do it sustainably, then the hope is that that can then be adopted in other countries and other locations that are really limited by the resources that they have, while also, again, controlling a source of their feedstock.
When you talk about local, when we talk about this dairy
Yeah,
and you talk
yeah.
about local, is that like right on the dairy, near the
It
dairy?
is.
What's the proximity to that?
I mean, it is right on the dairy farm. We are converting an existing barn into this vertical farm, and so that's one of the ways that we're reducing the land footprint, is that we are growing vertically instead of horizontally. And some of your viewers and listeners might have heard about vertical farming as, maybe potentially the next best thing in agriculture. And what that allows us to do, again, is to reduce the land footprint, to grow crops very densely, in small spaces, in a small footprint, but also using the volume of a structure. And a lot of times these vertical farms are built into existing structures that are no longer used, and that's what these guys are doing too. They have this dairy barn that they weren't using to full capacity, and they said, well, what if we convert it and turn it into basically a vertical farm? They weren't even calling it a vertical farm, I think, until I suggested that. And they're like, oh, that's what it is. And well, yeah, you're growing vertically. It is. And the beauty about that is that a vertical farm can be 2 levels, it can be 10 levels, it can, there's no limit. The sky is literally the limit to how tall we can grow. And we're starting, I would say, with a little bit of reservation, and we're starting kind of small. I mean, it's big. It's going to be the largest feed mill, but at the same time, I would say it's small. That there's only room for expansion, both horizontally and vertically, if we do things right here with this first project. So yeah, they are using resources that are already available to them to do this.
So how much, I mean, have you guys calculated? I'm sure you've looked at this as you look at the economics of it, but have you calculated, this is 5,000 cow dairy, how much of the feed will be replaced by what's being grown in this vertical operation?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot that goes into the feed mixes, right? And this is just one constituent of that. And the goal is to completely replace one of those constituents with this fresh wheatgrass that they don't need to pelletize, right? They don't need to buy a dried product of that. It's going to be grown right there on site, and they're going to harvest daily. So that's another thing that makes this, in my mind, sustainable. There's it when it comes to feed. What are some efficient ways to feed our cattle and our livestock? And the less frequently we feed, I want to say the less frequently the feedings are, right? But that can be more efficient. And so by doing daily harvest, there's going to be less waste of the feed that they give to their dairy cows. So the idea is to 100% replace one constituent of the feed, and do it on a daily basis. We're One of the things that I really appreciate about this partnership is that we're not making any big claims about what our savings are going to be, what our, what our new carbon footprint is going to be, or our water reduction is going to be, until we actually have data to prove it. And I think that's been a real challenge in the industry I typically and working in with, say, let's just say lettuce crops or food crops, is that there's been a lot of big claims that have been made and big predictions. But when it comes time to stand by the data, might not pan out the way that they expected. And even though it's still really great, right? If it didn't live up to that expectation, it feels like a failure. And that's something I really appreciate about working on this project is, we're going to wait until we have the data and we can stand by that data. And the plan, the goal, and so far everything is in place to be operational by the end of this year, by the end of 2024. So let's have another conversation a year from now, and we'll share a lot of those numbers that we can then stand by and
Yeah,
project.
that'd be great because I think people are wondering, how is this
Yeah,
going to work? But there is. I mean, you always have to have that kind of trial, and let's see how this is going to work, and let's see how the cows respond, and let's see what it means from even from like an employee standpoint, right? Because if
for
you're
sure.
harvesting, you got to somehow you. I mean, it's probably maybe it is. Is it automated when they go to plant and harvest, or is that all a hand kind of operation? What? How does that work?
Right. So there will be automation involved. I mean, there has to be at the scale that we're going to be growing this wheatgrass at. And I think that's also one of the big challenges that we're addressing with this facility. We all know that labor is a major challenge across the entire agricultural sector, especially here in the U.S. So by automating a lot of the process, we reduce that strain potentially by growing everything by hand, or watering by hand, or harvesting by hand. Sure.
So what is it in terms of getting a crop to harvest? Is it a couple weeks? Is it what's the time frame to grow
Three
this? I know
days.
micro how much? 3 days?
3 days.
Oh my. Wow, I did not expect that. I know microgreens take, a week or 2 and I'm like, "Okay," and I saw your sprouts are about this high and
Yeah.
3 days. Oh my
3
gosh.
days. I mean, you know, this is wheatgrass, and microgreens is actually the perfect analogy to how we're growing, or the product that's being grown, because we don't need to grow it out, to a really mature plant, right? We're actually stopping its growth at the point at which it's going to have the greatest nutrient value for the dairy cows. And these guys have done a lot of research ahead of time to figure out what's the sweet spot in that. And yeah, it's less than a week, it's less than 5 days. And anything beyond that, yes, there might be new characteristics that show up, and maybe other values that humans would appreciate and need. But in terms of what the cows need in their feedstock, 3 days, that 3 to 5 days, I think, is the sweet spot that they've landed on. So it's a really quick turnover.
Do
um
do you do like microgreens and chop it and then basically have to start over or does it regrow?
no, it does not regrow. They're going to harvest the entire product and then
Okay.
replant. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Wow,
Exactly.
that's very cool. So you don't have a number yet then on carbon footprint, overall for, say,
No,
indoor
I mean, I
growing
think
operations?
we've penciled out some predictions and some estimates, but I think we're kind of waiting, and right until we have that first crop to say, "Yep, we were right." Or honestly, maybe it'll be even better. That's the hope for, right? So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I'm sorry I can't give you those numbers quite yet.
That's all right. So you have to go though, I would assume, into some of these. I mean, if you're going into a facility like you're doing an existing facility, you have to do all kinds of tests, right? For air quality and
Right.
probably humidity and all of this. There's like a process then that gets this thing started, and then you determine that this facility is something that you could probably work with. Is that how the very basic starts on this?
I love that question. I talk about that topic a lot throughout our endeavor here and what we do in consulting. It always starts with the site, right? And finding the ideal site. And they knew right from the beginning that they wanted to be, in their existing barn that they weren't using. And so, they hired a structural engineer architect, who, looked at the bones of the building, figured out sort of what are the limitations, if there were any, in terms of, any sort of penetrations or attachments we could make to this building, how tall the building could be. And for us, as the HVAC engineers, as the mechanical engineers, we wanted to know, how can we move air through this building? How much cooling and heating and humidity control do we need to grow plants in such a high density inside this barn and in Hanford, California? I will say one of the benefits of being in California, as probably a lot of your listeners know, is we have a great climate. But we are on a dairy farm. So there is going to be dust and air quality challenges. But that's something we specialize in, is looking at air quality, using air filtration in order to remove dust and potential pollen and contaminants that might kick up and get distributed into the building. And so we put measures in place to prevent, the bad air from coming in. And then if it does, we're filtering it. And because of that really good climate that we have here, and yes, it gets really hot in the summer for sure, but it doesn't get that cold in the winter. But it's relatively dry here in California, and so something that we're able to do is take advantage of that dry climate here in California and use a lot of fresh air. So it's almost like, in some ways, we're growing outside using the air that's available outside, but we're just moving that air from outside to inside the space and recirculating it. And again, that was one of the things that really drew me to this project. Is we talk a lot to our clients about energy efficiency and water efficiency and land use efficiency. And those are, what I talked at the top of the hour about, all these claims that get made. But at the end of the day, cost becomes really prohibitive, or, just how do we manage the system? We want it to be as simple as possible. We say in HVAC that we're doing our job if it's invisible, and unseen and unheard, which does us a disservice, because then if we make it too comfortable until you have to put your sweater on because you're cold, right? Then, nobody knows it's there. And so, and so people end up kind of going the easy route, I would say. And energy and, sustainability kind of gets pushed aside. But with these guys, they're like, no, we want to be as efficient as possible. We want to use the least amount of energy as possible, the least amount of water as possible. And so when we were going through these ideas and concepts and systems around how we could reduce energy use to manage the temperature and humidity inside the space, they were all in. They're like, yes, we want that. We want to do whatever is possible to reduce our energy use, or limit our energy use. And, going back to your comment about the site, air quality and the building, but also utilities, right? And, we are now like looking at a barn. Well, is there any power going to that barn, right? Is there any gas going to that barn? And so that was one of the things that we had to talk about from the very beginning, is how much power, how much gas use do we think that these systems are going to use? And the HVAC system is going to use the majority of it. I mean, there's some pumps moving water around, right? There's that automation equipment. But other than that, it's us, it's on us. And so doing anything we can do to reduce that, so that they don't have to bring such a big power line over to the building, or maybe if there's gas on site, which they do produce, in California, there a lot of dairy farmers are producing, right, their own methane. We're not doing that, but we could, right? And that could be a next iteration, right? A future step, is how do we use the power, basically the energy that we're producing right here on site. That's a really exciting prospect for the future of this type of facility.
Now this could be a crazy question, but I just have to know. So you don't like put glass on the roof, right? You don't
No,
make it like a greenhouse. You just use all artificial light, or
Correct,
in the
correct. So
facility. Okay.
4 walls and a roof.
Okay.
Because, and one of the reasons is because, having a glass roof or having glass sides, is going to bring sunlight in, which, light is good for plants, but the heat, the solar
Mhm.
radiation is not so good. So we don't need that much for these plants. If we were growing tomatoes or even cannabis, right? They love a lot of light, and that might be a recommendation. But in this case, no, 4 walls and a roof gets it done, and it allows us to have more control over the season. So we're insulating this building, right? It was just a metal shell, right? Like you would expect a barn to be, but we're insulating to try to keep as much of the heat out in the summer and as much of the heat in during the winter. So that worked to our advantage here.
It's always fascinating to see or to hear about these kind of operations. I was in Missouri recently, and the facility next to where I was at was old grain bins, these big grain silos, and
Sure.
they said that someone had started growing mushroom seed, the little seedlings in there, and they started them at the top, and then they would rotate down on a train, and by the time they got to the bottom of the track, they were ready to ship to mushroom farmers to plant and to grow their mushrooms. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I wanted
Cool.
to go in and see it.
I want
Sometime
to
I
go
will," because I
visit
just
that facility.
so fascinating. But you mentioned at the top of the hour here insects, that you're doing some work
Yeah.
on insects, and we've had a question come in from our
Oh, cool.
audience. So give us a little background. What are you doing, and how do you do it when it comes to the insect production?
Insects are a completely different animal, pun intended. They are an animal. But, we have designed facilities for crickets, for mealworms, and for black soldier fly larvae. In fact, one of my engineers for her PhD actually studied black soldier fly larvae production and looked at different environments to maximize the protein content and reduce the substrate and water use to grow it. But yeah, so most of those projects have been in order to produce feed for either poultry or for pet food. In fact, my engineer Lydia, who did this for her PhD, she went around to local pet stores and did a survey and asked them, would you be interested in insects as a feed source in your pet food? Do you think that your customers would buy that? And they were all over it. They said, yeah, we're already getting samples. We're already starting to sell it. It makes a lot of sense because, I mean, if I just think of a chicken, right, and they're pecking at the ground, I mean, they're eating insects, right? They're probably crickets. They're probably so excited about getting some crickets in their food, in their feed. And also, we know that with pet food, a lot of it is the scraps, right, from animal, or not animal, from people food, from people, and as we eat less protein, and the number of pets increase and they need more protein, we need to find alternative sources, and I think they all like insects. So the differences with insect production is that they have multiple life stages, right? And so there's the larval stage, and then I mean, depending on which insect you're growing, right? You can have 3 or 4 different stages, life stages of their production, and then you want to harvest them before they can get away. Uh, and I mean, probably literally. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, humidity is a really big issue, but also the substrate that insects grow on can produce a lot of dust, and I want to call it dander. I know that's sort of a pet, sort of terminology, but they shed, right? And they have all this, uh the material, right, as they're growing from stage to stage, right, they're
Mhm.
shedding their material, and so there needs to be a way in order to manage that. And humidity can dampen it down, right, like we kind of spray down dirt roads, so it can kind of dampen it. But also air quality is a really big issue, and keeping that dust and sort of dander out from the air. And if it is in the air, how do we then process it out of the air, filter it out of the air. So we're always looking at air quality. But the other thing with insects is that they're almost more like mushrooms in the type of environment that they like, a little bit more damp. They don't need light necessarily, which makes the air conditioning side easy, but the humidity control side can be really hard because if we're trying to cool that space, then we might take out more humidity than we want. So then we need to find a way to add more humidity in. And so it's just a little different way of thinking in term, and you might have different rooms for those different life stages. And so we have to think about, okay, what does this room need? And, this stage of life versus this stage of life versus this stage of life. And if there's people also who are working in there and it's not fully automated, then we have to think about their quality of their working life as well, which is not always congruent, right, with the insect life cycle. So it's a fun challenge. I know it's a really growing industry, and it's really fun for us to look at. And I will say, to the person who asked this question, one of the areas that we're always looking for more data with insect production is how much heat and carbon dioxide they generate, because they breathe like we do, but there's usually a spike in their, when they're growing really fast in the first few days, and there's a spike of carbon dioxide. And so we have to remove that. So we need a lot of fresh air in order to remove that. But the other thing is that we don't have good data for every insect that we're trying to produce as feedstock, in terms of, how much heat they produce, how much CO2 they produce. And so, it's still a growing field, and there's still a lot of opportunity to gather that data and really get the HVAC right. Because that's what it comes down to when it comes to managing these environments, is understanding, not just what temperature and humidity, and air quality these various species need, plant or animal, but it's also understanding, how much they're generating or absorbing so that we can make up for it and balance it. It's the same for a dairy cow or, for a poultry farm. It's all the same, but, I would say for poultry and swine and cattle, we have a lot more historical data on that. But with some of these newer products like insects, not as much.
More work to do there. Do you
Exactly.
think though we can get to a large scale insect production kind of capacity? Is
I
that is something
do.
that's doable?
And I do. There are a few companies who are doing it or attempting to do it. I know there's one out of Europe, Insect with a Y. They are doing it successfully and are expanding their operations. I think they're looking maybe to come to the US. The facilities that we've worked on here in the US are pretty big facilities and are looking to expand. And I think part of it is I don't think we're as limited by can we do it. I think we're more limited by the market for it, and who is going to demand insect feed. And I think that's a marketing issue. And so going around to those pet stores, also going to pet food producers, maybe like Mars Corporation, and saying, is this of interest to you? I think they do have interest, I think. But to this point, coming back to Forever Feed, by growing their own feed on site, controlling a portion of their supply chain, right, having control over the source and quality and consistency of their product, that is a really driving factor for Forever Feed, is they are doing it on site rather than relying on other producers to do it and shipping it to them. So I would be really curious, for some of these pet food producers, you know, would they be interested? Are they interested in, just a few companies, in one company, in local locations where they're producing pet food? I know there's a few, there's they're not just producing pet food in one city, right, in one state. Maybe we set up shop close to where the pet food is being produced, to again, reduce the food miles or the feed miles associated with that, but also just improve consistency. I mean, I'm really lucky to be in California, right? I mean, I know that the quality of produce that I have in my fridge, right, is probably better than what my friends in New York have. Because by the time it gets from Salinas, right, to New York, it's lost water content. Some of those nutrients have broken down. And so the quality of that produce 3,000 miles away isn't as good as it is here. And I think that's one of the real benefits of growing local, this anytime, anywhere type of concept, is that not only, are you creating, hopefully, creating jobs and, and doing things here locally, but also improving the consistency and quality of what you are then eating or feeding to your animals.
Good points. And, insects are coming for human consumption
Oh
as
my
well,
gosh,
right?
I
We
don't
got
know if I'm
our
ready for that. I don't want to know.
I did have one once. It was, I don't know what it was. It tastes like cinnamon toast crunch cereal, and I managed to get it down. But yeah, it's supposed to be, ground up in flour. We wouldn't even know probably. It's
I
already
mean,
there, right?
that's so
It's a,
true. Exactly. Ignorance is bliss, Sarah. I just
yep.
don't.
So if folks are interested in learning more about this topic, do you have any resources or any advice on where they should turn?
Well, sure. You can always visit our website, www.drgreenhouse.com, with doctor spelled out. Forever Feed, they're going to be releasing more press releases over the next several months to keep everyone abreast of the progress that we're making. So stay tuned for that. Um, and I should
And
have
you've
been
got a
more ready for
podcast
that
too,
question.
right? You've got a podcast, I heard.
I do. I have a podcast. Yep. If any of your listeners want to be on our podcast and talk about the challenges or how you got into farming and ranching, I'd love to interview you. I interview a lot of growers. I interview a lot of manufacturers and companies that support our industry. And if you also just want to learn more about the importance of climate control for growing crops, and for even for humans, I do some lessons as well within my podcast. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have other questions, or if you're more interested in insects or animal feed production. We would love to talk to you.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Nadia. Appreciate all the insight. Very fascinating.
This was really fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and spending some time with us today. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 segments are available at feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.